All right, so welcome. Thanks for being here. As you're grabbing your food and drink, I'm going to get us started. I'm Russ Stark, Chief Resilience Officer, Mayor Carter's office, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe to give us a welcome from the Eastside Freedom Library. Peter.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you all for coming. What appears to have turned into a beautiful night after a kind of grim day. So welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. In another month, we will be marking our 5th anniversary here. This was, as many of you know, the Arlington Hills Public Library. Several people have said, oh, it's so nice you're hosting this. Well, when your landlord asks you to host an event, you certainly do it. So the building is still owned by the city, and we're still working on a 15-year lease, so we're just partway in. We are a nonprofit, and we're focused on labor, immigration, and social justice history. We wanted to create a space here on the east side where the descendants of European immigrants and new immigrants from Southeast Asia, Central America, and East Africa could come together to share their stories and hopefully, we felt, discover how much they really have in common. And it's pretty remarkable, I think, how that's been happening here. We're also at now about 20,000 books. Again, focused in these topics of labor, immigration, and social justice. A lot of the books engage art as a way of telling these stories. So there's poetry, theater, visual art, memoir, autobiographies, creative nonfiction, lots of great materials. We work a lot with kids that are doing History Day projects. We've had a team of retired teachers and college students here on Saturdays to mentor kids doing History Day projects, and kids who have worked with us have gone on not only to win state prizes but also to win national prizes. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity to poke around. The books don't go out. This is not a circulating library. People come in with their library card and say that's nice. But you have to use the books here. We've tried to create spaces where people are comfortable hanging around. So particularly the rocking chairs that you find around. And we do a lot of programming. So there are flyers on the old circulation desk for upcoming events and activities. I'll just mention one. This Friday night coming up, Tusek Lee will be here to introduce his new book, My Grandma Can Freestyle, about his experiences doing hip-hop poetry with his grandmother who did kutsia, the traditional Hmong form of poetry. So, and Tusek is quite an East Side icon, who recently had a Bush Fellowship to travel throughout the Hmong diaspora. He went to Australia, China, Vietnam, and Laos, learning and teaching hip-hop all around the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm going to turn things back to Russ so that we can get to what you're here for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for hosting, even if we are technically your landlords. We appreciate you opening the doors for us for this important conversation. So I'm realizing that one of the challenges is that I'm going to be blocking your view of the screen unless I'm over here. So, thank you for coming, everyone.
I should have mentioned that we are live streaming this on Facebook. And I'd like to warn people, if you're in the witness protection program, you don't want to be seen, make sure you're not in the lens of the camera. But this is being live streamed on Facebook. And there will also be photographs being taken, so cover your faces.
Thank you, Peter. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and Mayor Carter is on his way. We're going to go ahead and get started, and he's just going to pop in when he gets here and say hi for a few minutes. So once again, Russ Stark, Chief Resilience Officer at Mayor Carter's office, and the city is endeavoring to develop, as you all know, because you're here, a climate action resilience plan for St. Paul. We have not had a plan before. There has been work going on for a number of years on this front, however. The previous administration, the Coleman administration, did a lot of work kind of leading up to the creation of this plan. I want to give them credit where credit is due there. More recently, Mayor Carter signed on to what's called the Global Covenant of Mayors on Climate and Energy, which is a series of mayors across the world who have signed on to the idea that as mayors, they are committed to the Paris Climate Accords and beyond. And obviously, with the lack of federal leadership right now on this issue, cities are needing more than ever to step up to the plate and show leadership on climate action and resilience as we are seeing right in front of our eyes the changing climate. I'm going to just briefly mention what we're going to do tonight. We're actually not going to talk at you for most of the night. I'm going to present a high-level overview of the draft plan for about 15-20 minutes, plus Mayor Carter jumping in here for a few minutes at some point. After that, we're going to break you up into small groups, and 2 of the groups will be in the back of the room. We're going to rearrange the front to have some tables and 2 of the groups up here and go through a few exercises, one of which is just sort of opening, get people thinking and talking about climate change, what it means to them, etc. The second is a climate game that we've developed. It's actually primarily developed by an intern at the City of St. Paul. Who's put a lot of time and effort into it, so we hope you enjoy that. And then a wrap-up exercise at the end of the evening. So we're hoping to keep the program to about an hour and a half. So sorry we're starting a few minutes late. So why a climate action and resilience plan? I have a feeling I don't have to tell any of you here why we would do this. But at the city, we think it's really important to start planning for the types of actions that we need to take starting right now to become a more climate-friendly and resilient city. And let's dive into what that means. Oh, my projection is slightly off. All right, so I'm going to briefly go over the causes of climate change, the local impacts here in St. Paul, as well as some of the impacts that we're seeing elsewhere around the country and around the world. Vulnerabilities, meaning who and where are the most vulnerable places and people in St. Paul specifically to the changing climate. So that first half is really kind of about climate and resilience broadly. In the second half, I'm going to go over some of the strategies that are in the draft plan about how we intend to reduce emissions, both as a city, as a broader community, and with your help, as individuals as well. And then we will, as I said, start the process of breaking up into our small groups. We can take a couple of questions perhaps at the end of the presentation. So the basics of climate science. I think you all probably know this as well, but I think it's important that we continue to remind ourselves what this is really about. For mostly the last couple hundred years, we human beings have been pulling fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them in the form of coal and gas and oil for the purposes of business and production and heating and all those things. And the creation of greenhouse gas emissions from that burning, mostly carbon dioxide but also other things, literally traps more of the sun's heat closer to the Earth's surface. That's the basic idea of what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and global warming. And really why we're here tonight. So, and since I've just really started, it's a great time actually for me to bring the mayor up to give his his welcome. So, Mayor Melvin Carter, everyone.
Good evening. Hey, thanks for coming out here. I appreciate you coming today. Definitely appreciate the Eastside Freedom Library for hosting us here. You're always more than willing to host us, so really appreciate it. Please give a round of applause to our host here today. I'm Melvin Carter, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of serving as mayor of the most incredible city on the planet. And obviously you know what city I'm talking about when I say that. I get a chance to serve closely with a number of folks who are in the room, from our Chief Resilience Officer to the city, Russ Stark, to a good friend of mine who we've worked with together for quite some time. Councilmember Jane Prince is here with us as well today. Thank you for being here. Yeah, please. Look, our climate is changing. It's just a fact. And the impacts of climate change on our community are really real.
That's because Monsanto controls it.
And, you know, when I was a kid, you know, a lot of times we talk about the climate in these kind of abstract terms, right? We'd be talking about the ozone layer, right? We'd be talking about things that, you know, to me, didn't feel like they like touched my everyday kind of existence, right? We're having a whole different conversation about climate change right now. And that is, we're having conversations about the fact that we're seeing extreme weather events right here in Minnesota. That every time we turn on the news, we see fires and flooding all over the country in different places. That we've seen our temperature rise right here in Minnesota, 6 degrees in the winter, right? Like this is impacting our lives on a really direct level. And you know, the reports say that we got to do something about this, and it's really critical. But I kind of don't need the reports, because you know, if I can think about the extent to which from when I was growing up in St. Paul to now, that this has sort of gone from the ozone layer to the Mississippi River right here in St. Paul, then we can only imagine how much further this can go just in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years, if we continue to just not take action. And so our goal here in St. Paul is to ensure that we are doing everything that we can to be a climate responsible community. You know, I was pretty distraught and pretty disappointed, I have to say, when I saw our president say the United States is pulling out of the Paris Accords. That to me is an incredible mistake, and it's a pretty unfortunate thing. But the great thing that I want to share with you is that I'm one of hundreds of mayors across the country who have come together to say, you know what, we're going to keep our promises, and we're going to keep our commitment in America. We're going to continue to do this in America. And so some of the things that we're doing right now in St. Paul to be a part of this global movement, but certainly this national movement, this is why we created our first dedicated funding for bike lanes in St. Paul in our last year's budget. This is why we're investing in our sidewalks so that people have ways to get around our community in non-motorized fashions, right? This is why we're working, and this is much of this, all of this is through Russ's work. I was almost at Council President Stark's work, because he's our former council president. But this is why it's critical that we're retrofitting city buildings to be more energy efficient. This is why we're engaging commercial buildings all over our city in what we call Energize St. Paul, which, you know, I think Russ cringes every time I say it, but I just call it the biggest loser for buildings, right? You get what I'm talking about now, right? This is why we're doing this work, and this is why this work is so creative. This is why this work is so critical. I was excited this past fall when we were selected by Bloomberg as a winner, as one of a set of cities that they are working with in a climate challenge that they have to say, how can we do even better? How can we go even further? We got one of the grants, and Minneapolis got the grant, so being able to work with them means we're going to be able to do this work in a way that's greater than its sum of its parts, and that work centers really around those buildings, and I know Russ is going to be talking about this a lot, those commercial buildings, it's going to center around our homes, it's going to center around how we get around town, because we know our buildings and transportation create such a large percentage of our emissions right here in St. Paul. So that's why that work is going to focus there. The last thing I'll say, and I want to get out of the way because we have a lot of work to do, is the way we approach our work in St. Paul, and I see our PED director in the back as well, Bruce Corey. Thank you for being here, Dr. Corey. The way we approach our work right here in St. Paul is with the notion that, you know, we can't do it by ourselves. It's too big a city, there's too much going on for any one person as mayor to just sort of sit up in the back corner office on the third floor at City Hall and say, this is how we're going to chart the course. So your engagement is critical for us because we see you as like our board of directors. We see you when you come out and get engaged in this stuff. We love to do this, and we ask you to just sort of to continue to step in, to continue to say, here's what I think and feel about this. Here's what I think is missing from this strategy. Here's what I'd love to learn more about. And the feedback that we get from you provides the direction for how we move forward. So your presence here today says a lot. And we need you staying engaged in this conversation, but I want you to know as well that the feedback that you give us is absolutely going to inform this plan, and it's going to inform where we go moving forward. And one of the reasons, as a spoiler alert, that it has to is because we're going to ask you to continue to just step in with us to do that work moving forward. And so we want you to be able to see your passion, we want you to see your ideas, we want you to be able to see your input reflected in the final plan that we end up kind of landing on. So thank you for being here. It means a whole lot. I thank you for being our teammates in this work. I thank you for kind of literally being the choir that we're here preaching to today. And I'm just going to thank you in advance because we know just your presence in the room here today says that you know we have an enormous amount of work to do when it comes to our climate action and resilience plan. Thank you very much.
So building on those themes, we've all seen these images in the last few years in particular. This is one of the fires last year in California. If anyone knows people in California, and most of us probably know somebody, the stories of the on-the-ground impacts of the fires there over the last few years are really incredible. People not being able to go outside for days, or in some cases weeks, without getting uncomfortable, without the air that they breathe not being healthy. Not to mention the resources that it's taking to try to fight the fires, and the resources that are being spent to try to prevent the next ones from possibly happening. This is an image of Hurricane Harvey in Houston from not too long ago. We talked about the Mississippi flooding here in St. Paul, and the city and our staff have really gotten used to being at flood stage in Mississippi because we've been at major flood stage, I believe it's 4 times in 15 years now. And so our practices and that our staff have to do in terms of shutting down Shepherd Road and closing off and cutting off the electricity to Harriet Island have become, unfortunately, pretty routine. But all that work is costing the city real money on a very regular basis. We are dealing with climate change today, not maybe as visibly as a place like Houston or like the fires in California. But here are a few images here in St. Paul, and some of these will be familiar to you. We got the sunlight streaming in, making it a little harder to see. But the flooding in Mississippi didn't look much different from that last week, as well as a few weeks ago. The two different crests. This is actually from several years ago, the last flood, but just in terms of some of the local impacts and the impacts on that infrastructure of ours, of being flooded over and over again. Obviously, it's not gonna hold up as long as it would otherwise. We've got another image here of major branches blowing down in storms. We're seeing more frequent storms. The storms are producing more precipitation on average. our forestry crews need to be out and about cleaning up after these storms on a much more regular basis. Again, real cost, real time of city staff, your taxpayer dollars at work. And that actually prevents them from doing some of their normal tree trimming and maintenance that they would otherwise be doing. And so we're having to increase our budgets in forestry, both for storm cleanup as well as emerald ash borer. The other image, of course, before I switch here, is of the major slope failure, as we call it, or rock slide, just onto Wabasha, which closed that street, a major connector between the west side and downtown, for many months. And it was not coincidental that the slide happened after I believe it was our wettest spring on record last year, creating the opportunity for that material to want to move around. There are two primary trends to climate change in Minnesota broadly, and specifically here in St. Paul. And the first is that we're getting warmer. The mayor mentioned it. We are already 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in winter on average than we were in 1970. And when that's the difference between 16 below and 10 below, not too many of us are complaining. But when it's the difference between 24 degrees and 30 degrees, or 26 degrees and 32 degrees, and it creates that freeze-thaw cycle and ice. And I don't know, how many of you heard really bad stories about people falling on the ice this year? I know I heard many, almost everybody in the room. That's a side effect, I would say, of some of these changes that we're experiencing, where we're getting warmer, so more of our precipitation is falling as something other than snow. We expect to get another 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by sometime in the middle of the century. You know, the projections are not precise, but based on the trajectory that we've been on, we've been getting about a degree warmer Fahrenheit in winter so far per decade. We haven't seen the warming show up much in summer yet, but all the climate scientists believe that is coming as well. We're getting wetter, and I talked about it briefly in terms of the heavier precipitation storms. We're already getting 7 inches more per year of precipitation than we did in the 1950s. That's close to a 30% increase, I believe. And we're projecting another 3 to 6 inches on average per year by the middle of the century on top of that. The big difference here, even beyond the increased precipitation, is that more of that precipitation is falling in fewer events. So we're getting more of the 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 inch rainstorms. And our infrastructure was not really designed to handle those larger storms. So we get more localized flooding from the storm drains not being able to handle that amount of water, for example, especially if we're not clearing those drains. So briefly to talk about the vulnerabilities I mentioned. We think about vulnerability both in terms of people and places. And for people across our community, the most vulnerable fit into a number of categories. But if you are low income or low wealth person or household, the chances of you being able to adjust when there's a power outage, when something is happening that may be climate related, are simply lower. The resources literally available to you are fewer. People of color and Native people across our community, for a variety of reasons, tend to be more vulnerable. And we'll get into it in places, but they tend to live in some of the more vulnerable places, and they tend to have, unfortunately, other challenges, sometimes language, and related issues in our community. Health challenges, of course. If you are reliant on dialysis or some other machine that relies on electricity, you are very aware of the dangers of the potential of a power outage, for example. The very old and the very young are almost always the most vulnerable populations in our community. And with the very young, because they are generally so heavily cared for, there's sort of a set of issues. With the very old, the issue tends to be social isolation and people not necessarily knowing where they are or if they're okay in the case of an extreme heat event or some other type of event that could be a threat. I want to actually briefly touch on this social isolation issue. There's a relatively untold part of the story about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans back in 2005, where, and this has been written up in the last few years, the Vietnamese community in New Orleans, which is actually quite a substantial community there, the story was that many folks in the Vietnamese community lived in some of the most heavily affected areas from Katrina, and yet they had a really low rate of fatality and injury, and also were able to rebuild pretty quickly. And the analysis is that it was a result of their social cohesion, that community members knew one another, they knew where their vulnerable community members were, they went and helped them right away, and those social connections are really important in those times of emergency. So briefly about the places, we know that parts of our community have less of a tree canopy than others. And sometimes that's just downtown doesn't have a lot of trees, for example, or an industrial area. But there are big differences across our neighborhoods as well in terms of tree canopy. And our current big threat to tree canopy, of course, is the emerald ash borer, which is unfortunately taking thousands and thousands of trees from us a year at this point. And about 20% of St. Paul street trees are ash. There's also the issue of air pollution. And some folks are more directly affected by air pollution because of where they live. If you live close to one of the freeway corridors in St. Paul, the average level of pollution around your home is going to be greater. In some cases, it could be close to certain industries. Some parts of town are more vulnerable to flooding. Of course, the river itself, but there are parts of St. Paul, and you all have experienced them. How many people had water in their basements this early spring from the snow melt plus rain plus snow melt plus rain? Yeah, a lot of folks, and we have reason to believe that that kind of thing will be happening more often. And then finally, impacts on our infrastructure. The pictures showed you some of those challenges, but you think more broadly about the different types of infrastructure the city maintains. Our sewer system in St. Paul, the least visible part of our infrastructure, is $1 billion asset in the city. If you think about the cost of potentially having to upgrade that infrastructure for larger amounts of water. This map tries to get at the combination of these two factors, the people and the places that are most vulnerable. So it looks at tree canopy, it looks at exposure to air pollution, it looks at demographic information. And of course, one of the reasons that tree canopy is so important is that on a really hot day, the heat index in St. Paul might be as much as 10 to 15 degrees higher than it is out in Minnetonka. Because so many of our surfaces are hard surfaces, they are absorbing heat and keeping heat close to the ground versus a highly vegetated or area full of trees. So this map, you probably can't see it very well at all, but you can see the colors, and what this does is identifies the highest risk parts of our community are in red, medium in yellow, low risk in the light green, and very low risk in the dark green. And it doesn't take long to realize that our very low risk communities are some of our most economically well-off communities, down in Mac Groveland and Highland, for example, and around Como Park. And that our highest risk communities in Frogtown, Thomasdale, right here where we're sitting tonight, along that 35E corridor in Pink Fallon, and further east in Dayton's Bluff and elsewhere on the east side, tend to be some of our lower income communities with other challenges as well. And so as we think about the strategies for addressing becoming a more resilient city, we're going to have to really think about focusing some of our attention and resources into those areas. So I'm going to transition now from talking about resilience to talking about emissions and what we're going to need to do to reduce our emissions. Two high-level goals. One, to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the city of St. Paul by 2050. Why is that the goal? Because it has to be. We have to get to the point of essentially zero emissions by about the middle of the century in order to avoid much worse impacts over time across our community, across the country, and across the world. The second high-level goal is to reduce our emissions 50% by 2030. And while 0 by 2050 is going to be challenging, I'm here tonight to tell you that I believe 50% by 2030 is a lot, and that we also have to do it. And that is really our task tonight as we break up into small groups and talk about some of the ways in which we're going to try to do that together. Most of our emissions, as the mayor mentioned, and you can't see this full chart, but I will just read it to you. Most of our emissions come from the energy used in buildings like this one, both to heat and cool and electricity, and our transportation. Commercial buildings are actually responsible for about twice the level of emissions overall as residential. Now that includes big users like big industry and the energy that they are using for their processes. Residential buildings do account for about 20%, transportation about 30%. So together, the energy used in buildings and transportation, 93% of our emissions, so that's where we have to focus the majority of our energy. Just briefly, in the energy sector, our priorities really need to focus on energy efficiency. The cheapest way to reduce our emissions is always going to be to use less energy in the first place. And reduce our need to burn anything while we are transitioning to cleaner sources of energy. Reducing energy burden is a really high priority in the plan. Energy burden refers to the fact that the average household in St. Paul spends about 2% of its income for energy. But there are census tracts in the city that spend 8 to 12% of their income on energy. And so where we can actually get at energy use reductions and energy savings and efficiencies in some of our lowest income housing, we can have ripple effects throughout the economy of not only reducing our emissions, but of giving a great financial benefit to some of our worst off residents. So a few basic strategies there. We've got to get more folks into energy conservation programs in their homes. We need to create incentives for more green power purchases around town, more solar on rooftops, and new green building standards that will require all new construction to be built to a really high efficiency standard. This last one we're actually working on, but state law requires that cities in Minnesota all have to stick with the state's building and energy code. So we're actually talking to the state this year about giving us the permission to go above and beyond that code to a higher standard. Transportation, just briefly, none of this is new or surprising to any of you. We have to reduce all of our single occupant vehicle use, as that's the least efficient way to use the fuels that we're using. We've been talking about that for a long time. We've got to get more serious about it. The ways that you do that are the lower three items. We've got to increase transit ridership and use significantly. That's going to require making transit a lot better than it is today. As you know, the city doesn't run transit, and so that's going to have to be a partnership with the state, the region, the Met Council, our other communities across the Twin Cities, but it's a really high priority for us here in St. Paul. Increasing biking and walking is a part of the solution. The mayor mentioned some of those investments that we're making, and ultimately, we're not going to get more people biking and walking unless they feel and believe it will be much safer than it is today as an option for different kinds of trips. And then finally, electric vehicles. Good news, bad news here. The good news is that the cost of electric vehicles is coming down tremendously, and most people expect that they will be cost competitive with traditional vehicles within the next few years. When that happens, they'll actually be cheaper because their operating and maintenance costs are already much lower. It's already the case, especially with the federal tax credit, that buying an EV over the course of its life, you're probably actually going to break even or maybe even save a little bit of money because there's so much less maintenance costs. That's going to require a whole lot of new infrastructure for us to move to EVs. We're going to need charging infrastructure in our homes, on the streets, in areas where people live in apartments because they don't have the option of having their own off-street charging, as well as at destinations where people will need to go get a charge and keep moving. Solid waste, the city council, when I was on it, actually created some really strong goals around solid waste diversion. Waste is a smaller component of contribution to emissions, but an important one nonetheless. We have to keep moving toward less landfilling and incineration and more recycling and composting. This graph, which I'll describe just briefly, is in the plan, and some of the critical information is off screen.
Push it closer. No,
Further away.
I mean, yeah.
So essentially, and just briefly, the top red line is where our greenhouse gas emissions would go if we essentially do nothing. Business as usual. They'll go up because our population is growing. We continue to use more energy over time. Xcel Energy, as you may know, has committed to going 100% renewable electricity by 2050. And so at the end of the chart here, you've got 2050. The second line down is the difference that Xcel will make by going 100% renewable by 2050. Out of the total emissions across our community by 2050, that's a pretty big chunk. The actions that we've identified in this plan would reduce emissions by this second amount. That would get us about 70% below business as usual. That still leaves 30% of those emissions out in 2050 where we haven't even identified the strategies that are going to get us there. Just to give you a sense of, we've got some pretty big, bold strategies in this plan. It's not going to get us all the way there. So we're going to have to continue to get creative, and some of the solutions are going to have to continue to emerge. Very briefly, a couple of things that folks can do to prepare for some of those events that we talked about. Get to know your neighbors. Get to know your neighbors is the easiest one. Prepare an emergency kit for your home. I think many of us feel like, oh, that'll never happen to me, it's not a big deal. And of course, when it happens, we regret it. Doing small things like planting rain gardens around our homes and buildings and clearing those storm drains can make a big difference when these events hit. On a scale from changing out your light bulb at the top to living car-free at the bottom, most of us are probably familiar with the kinds of things that we can do on a day-to-day basis to make a difference. It feels insignificant when we make a small change in our own lives. I can tell you it's not. And when more of us do it, the impacts are really big across our community. I don't want to suggest, however, that the answers are in our individual behavior. The bigger answers have to be at the systemic and policy level. But there are things that we can each contribute personally as well. That is the end of my 20-minute spiel. I hope I didn't go too far over. And I would like to take a couple of questions, and then we're going to transition into the first small group exercise. Quick questions that I can... Yes, ma'am?
I was just at a training this weekend, and a lot of the people that were there were from California, and they're not calling it climate change anymore. They call it climate catastrophe. And it's urgent that we move, and so I'm really excited to hear that the city's going to be doing some things, but we have to move really fast. We don't have a lot of time. My question to you is, solar energy is really expensive. I'd have it on my roof if I could afford it, but a lot of us can't afford those solar energy panels. What is the city going to do to help all of us get those panels on our houses, not just the people that have higher incomes?
Great, thank you for that question. So the question was, she mentioned that in California, folks are talking about climate catastrophe, not climate change, just as a general term. And then the question was around solar, and solar being expensive at the level of the individual homeowner to install today, which is very true. Although depending on your level of, like how much sun your house gets, increasingly there are solar providers who have packages where with using tax credits that are available, very low cost up front, and you pay for it essentially with the energy that you are producing and saving over time. That's not for everyone, and it's only if you have really good solar access. But one of the other opportunities we can look at are community solar gardens. Community solar gardens are built at a larger scale. Typically, so far they've been built out in the suburban communities where there's more land to install them on the ground. In some cases on big rooftops of big buildings. And then the ability to buy that solar power directly in a certain model is offered to nearby residents to that installation. And so we are exploring those options. Today there's a state law that says that you can only buy into a community solar garden if you are in that county or a neighboring county, and there's legislation to possibly open that up further, can be considered at the state. So I think there are new tools and options being developed. In the climate game, that this is one of the topics. We're going to ask you to give us some ideas about how to prioritize this versus some of the other actions. All right, let's take just one or two more questions, and then we're going to break up into groups. Yes?
If we did everything on your big graph, the one that kind of sweeps around, say we did everything right, and that last 30%, we figured out how to do it, and St. Paul was on a perfect plan, and all around us there's people who aren't doing it. How much more do we have to prepare for climate change that we can't stop?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? I guess my basic answer is we have to do everything that we can, right? And we have to rely on our community members in neighboring communities and in the rest of the world to start doing the same. In the meantime, what we can control is what we can control, right?
I'm thinking more of in the disaster preparedness than,
Oh,
yeah.
and the disaster preparedness side.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and good coordination with our neighboring communities and counties and the state is really important. Our emergency management department has really good plans based on a lot of exercises that they've participated in across those jurisdictions. I think one of the challenges is how we communicate those plans to the public so that people know what they're supposed to do, even though our staff may know what they need to do in the cases of those emergencies. All right, one more quick question.
Would you like to speak?
Go ahead.
You can go ahead.
It appears that the authorities were more interested in feeding the California fires rather than putting out the California fires.
Okay, that was more of a statement than a question. So I think what we're going to do is move on to what we really wanted to do tonight is spend most of our time in these small groups where you're going to get a chance to talk amongst yourselves and then report out to the larger group as well.
It's a big question about the schools and the public buildings.
Okay.
Are they going to be putting solar community power on parks and on schools? There's a lot of buildings.
That was my question.
Okay, so the question is about whether
Thank you.
whether we're going to be putting solar on our large buildings, such as schools and other large public buildings. There's a lot of conversation happening with the school district right now about this question. I guess I would classify their response as really interested and trying to figure out how to take those next steps. There are good examples out there for us to start looking at and following. They are a much bigger owner of large rooftops than we at the city are. When you talk about smaller roofs, like something 5,000 to 10,000 square feet, the overall sort of penciling out doesn't look nearly as good as with a larger rooftop. And so I think the school district rooftops are a big opportunity, particularly if those roofs are in good shape. And I know that they are doing an inventory right now of the condition of their roofs as sort of a first step to determining what they can do further. So thank you for that question. All right, I'm now going to have us break up into groups. There are 2 tables already arranged in the back. One where some of these folks are right now, and one further back into the stacks. What we're going to do here up front is actually bring a table into this side and a table into this side and reorient the chairs around those tables. So we're going to take and we're going to start the climate game. I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of the game, but there will be table facilitators of the game to walk you through it. And the game is really designed to look at some of these different actions and initiatives that we're going to have to take as a community, as a city, and to talk through them and prioritize them and talk through some of what the challenges will be. And so we've got a transportation table, we've got a residential energy table, and then we'll have a commercial energy table and a waste and water table. So what I'll ask you to do is basically just break up into 4 groups, and there will be facilitators at each table, and ask your help in rearranging chairs up here. we're gonna stay in the same group the whole time.
Washington Ramsey County Biz Recycling for more access for businesses to recycle. Create greater awareness of water conservation through educational outreach and promotional materials, including the use of low flow shower heads. And identify opportunities for businesses with large hot water loads like laundromats and hospitals to install solar thermal technology and support residents and small businesses to electrify water heaters and use as thermal storage.
All right. Thank you. All right, just because you're close and convenient for me right now, commercial energy. Mike?
So we were looking at ways to improve energy efficiency and stuff on for commercial businesses. And the methods that we ended up going with were establishing green building standards to require building owners to report on their energy usage, which was the highest impact option, as well as providing education.
Hey Mike, speak up a little.
Okay.
Or closer to the mic.
All right, how's this? All right, so we were looking to establish green building standards and require building owners to report on their energy usage, which was the highest impact option available. Also, we're looking to provide educational information for small business efficiency programs in multiple languages. Also, offer low-interest loans for solar installations and heat recovery projects, and also to provide information on alternative energy options such as solar gardens. Yeah, we had a lot of debating back and forth about there was definitely a lot of resistance from large business owners for establishing the code because no one wants standards given to you. But we were, and also discussed the benefits of solar gardens, and also discussed the opportunities for, as part of those loans, possible models for inclusive financing, where government grants or something could be given up front, and then a cut taken from the energy that would be generated over time would pay for itself within a matter of years. So it could be a good long-term investments.
Thank you. All right, do we have transportation and residential energy folks wanted to come up? Bobby? Thank you, Mike.
So I'm doing transportation. So we were supposed to have a max of 12 green stars, but we have 13.
Baker's
So we did put the two things that had the most impact on here. One was incentivize mixed use and higher density development, more units per acre to reduce single passenger car trips. And the other is eliminate minimum parking requirements and set parking maximums for most land use types. Adjust parking fees to capture full cost of parking in downtown and other commercial districts. And then we, for people who get around in other ways, we had improve transit coverage, speed, and reliability in areas of concentrated poverty to increase access to jobs and destinations. Complete construction of 195 miles of bike lanes or paths currently in the St. Paul Bicycle Plan. Improve bicycle access on public transportation and invest in driver education to promote biker visibility and acceptance on city streets. Yes, please. Anyway. Fill in the 327 miles of sidewalk gaps, focusing on the high priority areas defined in the city's pedestrian plan, and redesign roads to be safer and more comfortable for people. And I think that was all of them.
All right, thank you, Bobby. So you can get a sense we're going to have to do a lot, right? We got a lot of stuff to do. All right, you here for residential energy? Awesome.
We were talking off the page a lot of the time, talking about renters and individuals and how we can get participation at that level The ones we picked off of our page were to establish green building standards and require homeowners to report energy costs to buyers and renters. We thought that that was really important. Provide access to solar power for all income levels by offering low-interest loans for residential solar installations and host a community solar garden. And both of those are pretty expensive, but we thought that they'd be really worthwhile. Host information sessions on solar garden installations and renewable energy options, and really keep the flow of information going back and forth from the neighborhoods to the people at the city. And then create a working group to coordinate residential outreach to decrease energy costs. And our thought was, as we increase density, and our focus should be on increasing density, I mean, to make things more efficient, so, you know, maybe not tearing down a bunch of housing stock, but figuring out how to get more people to live naturally within those dwellings. I know that on the block that I'm at one time there were 250 children on the facing sides of the street that were under 18. And now there's probably maybe 80 people living in that space, or maybe 100. So, I mean, it's things that we could do to really get some density. But the other piece was to create these working groups at the very local level. So part of the problem is outreach, right? And a lot of efficacy, and we've got a lot of the choir in this room. And how do we reach out to the people that aren't a part of the choir? And I think that requires efficacy in the working groups, so that people feel like they have some power, and when they ask for something from the city, that the city will listen. So I think that should be something that we think about.
All right. Great. Well, we obviously had really in-depth discussions going on. Thank you so much for all of the work. This work is going to really directly inform the plan and the priorities reflected in the plan. As we start to wind down the evening, there's one more exercise that we wanted to walk you through. This table got started early. They were a little precocious. The waste of water folks are just, things move fast in the waste and water world. The exercise, and some of you may have seen this before because the mayor's office did these with our Imagine St. Paul events earlier this year, if you participated at all. We'd like you to fill out the form that's in front of you in blue called For St. Paul. This version of For St. Paul, we're asking you to look at 4 actions that you personally would commit to taking in order to have some impact on this issue. And then on the back side, choose one of those that you really want to highlight as the thing that you're going to commit to do. Those 4 actions, one would be something that you can do yourself in your own day-to-day activity. Another would be something that you would do to support a family member or a friend in reducing their impact. The third would be something that you can do at the neighborhood scale, whether that's just cleaning up and beautifying the neighborhood or bringing people together and creating that social cohesion in a new way, better communication. Finally, the last one is something that you will do to speak up at a public level. You're here tonight. This is a start, and so we appreciate this being one of those examples. But give us another example of something that you're willing to do to be part of the solution by speaking up. And then on the back, again, highlight one of those. And if and a few of us will be going around the room. On that back side, if you're willing, we'll take some photos of you holding up that larger side of the document with the thing that you've committed to, and we'll spread those commitments out over social media at hashtag For St. Paul. So as you're doing that, I also distributed half sheets of an evaluation form for this event. We'd appreciate feedback about the event itself as we're trying to get better at doing our community engagement work. What worked here, what didn't work so well, are basically the 2 questions. And as we do this last exercise, I'll give you just about 5 minutes to work on that, and we'll have a few people report out, and then we're pretty much done for the evening. So, thanks.
Russ?
Are we collecting the completed for St. Paul?
So with the completed for St. Paul documents, the question was, are we collecting them? And I guess the ideal would be that we would collect those so we have a sense of what those commitments are. I understand that you may also want to keep it to remind yourself of what your commitments were.
Take a picture of it.
Yeah, if you take a picture of both sides, then you've got it and we've got it. Thank you.